Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all have been having a great time here at the symposium. I want to just welcome you all to our panel and just say I'm really excited to be here. It's my first time at the Acquisition Symposium. I am Laura Sayer. I'm the Executive Director of the Commission on PPPE Reform, so the DoD's resourcing process. I know, why would we invite a budget nerd here to the Acquisition Forum? But I think you all know you can have a great acquisition strategy, a great requirement, a fabulous contract, but if your funding's not aligned, you really can't go anywhere. It's like having a plane without any fuel, right? So you can't go anywhere. I'm actually an acquisition professional too. I've spent 26 years with the Department of Defense, about half of it in a program office working on space systems. So I'm pretty hardened as a PPPE and an acquisition practitioner. I'm excited to be here today and to welcome you as we talk about how other organizations do it, what the international and non-DoD federal government agencies can teach us. And joining me here today are three amazing panelists to my left. First, I'm pleased to introduce Ms. Stephanie Young, who is a senior researcher and director of the Resource Management Program in RAND's Project Air Force. Her primary interests relate to budgeting, acquisition, and resource allocation processes in DoD and DHS, and many other areas of interest as well. Most notably, her PhD dissertation was on the defense budgeting process. So welcome, Stephanie. Also joining is Megan McKernan, a senior defense researcher at RAND and associate director of the RAND National Security and Research Division's Acquisition and Technology Policy Program, and she specializes in DoD weapons systems acquisition and many other areas as well. Again, a great partner with us on our research on PPPE reform. And then rounding that out, we have Ms. Heidi Peters, also a policy researcher at RAND, and she was an analyst in the U.S. Defense Acquisition Policy at the Congressional Research Service, where she managed a research portfolio in support of congressional members and staff. And again, she's done great research in support of the commission. So before we dig into the details of the research, I wanted just to click through a few slides to set the stage for the commission itself. I'm guessing that many of you haven't had a chance to read our final report. It's pretty hefty. So I just wanted to give you that sort of background before we dig into the details of the research. So here again is our problem statement, and then a little bit about the commission. So the Commission on PPPE Reform was established by Congress in the 2022 National Defense Authorization Act. It's a legislative advisory commission, so part of the legislative branch, not the executive branch. And we were instructed to look at all four phases comprehensively of PPPE and make recommendations getting after defense modernization. That was one of the main areas of concern that Congress had. In fact, in all of our regular engagements on the Hill, they kept talking about the need to move faster. So here's a little bit about our research approach. I don't expect you to look at every bubble on the slide, but Congress was very specific in the establishing language on what they wanted us to research. Almost all of these research areas was directed by them, looking at the workforce or the budget structure. There were other areas we decided to look at as well. We did a lot of hard research from the organic staff of the commission. We pulled a lot of execution data. We looked at reprogrammings, new starts. Again, how many years have we had CRs over the last 20 or so years? And then some of the really fascinating research was the comparative case studies that Congress asked us to do, which this team took on a couple of those. So we looked at the private sector, and then what you're going to hear about today is the research about how Russia and China, as well as some of our partners and allies, how do they do defense resourcing, as well as non-federal agencies. So again, this is 2 years worth of research, over 400 different engagements from the commission's perspective, talking to well over 1,100 individuals. And so this, I'll go to the next slide here. This slide shows you, we talked to the entire PPP ecosystem, from Congress, former and current staffers, same with DoD practitioners, industry, a lot of engagement with industry and hearing about their concerns working with the department, as well as a lot of great research from FFRDCs and academia. And I think many of you know, if you've slugged through the PPPE process while you're trying to get your contract awarded or your great idea funded, that it's just not an agile process, right? So if you had a new idea you wanted to put on contract in 25, you were hoping for funding, you needed to have that idea into the budget process 2 to 3 years in advance, right? So you would have had to know that and to know that some new technology was coming on board that you couldn't foresee, which is just not possible, right? The process is just unforgiving. And so we're looking at ways to build that agility into the process by looking at best practices around the globe. And so as we looked at the problem set, and I think you've heard today throughout the different panels and sessions, the environment has changed. We have an evolving threat. We have the pacing threat from China. We have issues in the Middle East. And then the way technology is evolving and developing is very different today. It iterates on a faster cycle time. It's not every few years, it's every 2 to 3 months. You might have a new app or a new algorithm. And a lot of development is driven by the private sector now, and not as much coming from the Department of Defense as had been in the past. So with that, we came up with these recommendations. I do have around the room these handouts that have information on our recommendations. That's just for your information. But with that, I want to turn it over to this great panel, and Stephanie, over to you to talk about what you found with China and Russia.
Thanks so much, Laura. And thank you, everybody, for the opportunity to talk about this work today, and to the commission for sponsoring it. I think I have slides. You can move to the next set. But in short, we'll be talking today about 3 different types of case studies that Laura suggested. First are the ones that I'll speak to are the near peer competitors, which was required in the NDA language. And then Megan will talk to some cases of our highly capable U.S. allies and partners. Thank you. Green is green. Thank you. And then Heidi will talk to some of our non-DoD U.S. government agency cases. I won't go through this. This just speaks to the commission's mandate. So we completed 16 case studies that are very detailed and are all available in reports that are on our website. So please, if you're interested in the details and any of the topics we talk about today, check out that work. It's available for free download. We're also happy to send you hard copies if you're inclined. So on this website, you have the first 4 volumes of the work, which were inputs to the commission's interim report, and then today, I guess, landed three more volumes that were inputs to the commission's final report. Please do also keep an eye out. We have some derivative work that's looking at AUKUS and some unique challenges that came out of the European case studies. So, NATO issues and other things that were specific to that theater. So we'll have 2 more publications at some point that will, when they're cleared for release, that'll be available here. So this website's sort of a landing page for all this work. So please do check it out if you're interested in more details. I'll just talk briefly to the methodology of the overall study. We'll just do this once, I promise. And this is all interrelated work. But first, we had a really diverse team supporting this effort. These case studies, as I talk about which ones we actually looked at, are a really diverse set of international cases, and the U.S. government agency cases were all very distinct from each other and from DoD as well. So we leveraged our RAND US colleagues and our RAND Europe colleagues in Cambridge, and RAND Australia and Canberra. And within our U.S. office, we all primarily work on national security issues, but we have a division that focuses on Homeland Defense or Homeland Security. We have a division that focuses on healthcare. So we drew on people from across RAND with different kinds of substantive or regional expertise that was necessary to do this work. We built a consistent case template. So if you do check out these case studies, you should see the same broad topics covered. We have sections that look at each of the 4 stages in each of these cases: planning, programming, budgeting, and execution, as well as oversight. And for the international cases, we quickly realized that we really needed to set some context in terms of overall governance structures and stakeholders within that country to make sense of the budget mechanics. So we include that kind of contextual material as well. Inputs, we drew on publicly available information. More on data caveats and limitations there in a second, but publicly available information. This was policy or guidance, documentation. And for our international cases, this was almost always in non-English. So we had colleagues leading these case studies who could do the primary research and interviews in Chinese, Russian, French, German, Japanese, and Swedish. So that was an important part of how we did this work as well. So in addition to the publicly available information, I think many of us who work in this field know that what's written down isn't always the full story of how these processes work. So we sought to engage with as many knowledgeable personnel for interviews as we could access. That was currently serving government personnel, former government personnel, researchers, media, people who knew a lot about how these systems worked in practice. In total, across this effort, we interviewed about 170 subject matter experts. So we definitely connected with a lot of people in support of this work. So about just on data limitations. So clearly, there's going to be some challenges with accessing the full story through publicly available sources. This is especially true for the cases I'll talk to, Russia and China, where there's general opacity of decision making and not a lot available to us. When this work was starting, also we were the Russia's invasion of Ukraine had recently kicked off, which created additional challenges for getting any sort of reliable information on defense matters in Russia, as well as certainly any access to researchers or other people in Russia who speak to US researchers. So there were some challenges, but that's how we approached the work. We also met, we had the opportunity to meet monthly with the commission to just share what we were learning from these cases and get vector checks and make sure that they're getting what they needed in terms of insights. So these are the cases we looked at. China and Russia, our allies and partners indicated there, and non-DoD US government agency cases here. Just a few words about case selection. So near peer competitors was set in the legislation. For allies and partners, I mean, my sense of some of the considerations that went into selection, I think we were interested in cases that had a similar set of political commitments, or certainly a certain orientation towards a common strategic vision. There's the US, the sort of partners we potentially want to learn from. So there was that consideration. We're also interested in cases that had at least some degree of industrial capacity. So these were countries that were grappling with similar issues that the commission was thinking about in a US context around enabling innovation, how to make sure that you had kind of flexibility and agility and execution to meet changing needs, how to leverage commercial things like that, the same sorts of considerations that the US might deal with. So those are broadly the kind of considerations that went into that. For non-DoD, similarly, we looked at cases that at least had some degree of investment or modernization portfolio. They were grappling to some degree with technology, commercial sector, and the same kind of things that the DoD was thinking about. Now, not exclusively, you'll see a couple of agencies here that doesn't seem to be clearly the case. We were also interested in a couple of cases where, just by virtue of mission requirements, there were some unique needs for being agile or flexible. So thinking about DHS and disaster response, for which requirements might be unpredictable year to year. And when we were starting this work, also looking to HHS for how they handle COVID response. So it's just some lessons from how other agencies were thinking about meeting dynamic needs. And then on the right, you see the kinds of things we were looking for in these cases. So certainly descriptive features of these systems, and then strengths and weaknesses in terms of meeting mission needs presented by their systems. For the competitor cases, understanding what this might mean about the strategic environment. So what this means about how the US should think about RED in those cases. And then last, I just wanted to note, there's these cases are long, but they could have been much longer. So in terms of focus on what the commission was most interested in, we were particularly interested in these cases on budget and execution. So very interested in how they actually, could actually, identify a need and realign resources in a period of execution. We are more interested, I'd say, than on acquisition accounts than on ONS in general. So more interested in how they're making decisions about RET and procurement. And in general, for these cases, we didn't seek to broaden our interview engagements outside of the agency of interest. So for example, this is primarily relevant for the non-DoD US government cases, but we looked at really decision-making within that entity and did not seek to fully explore engagements with the Congress or engagements with the OMB or other key stakeholders, just as our primary area of focus. We certainly sought to capture those lessons when they were apparent to us, but it was not the primary focus or scope of the work we did. So I'll turn to talking a bit about Russia and China. Clearly, this is required by the NDAA, so this is going to be included. But we also looking to understand how the NDS was thinking about these competitor cases, thinking about facing challenge, the acute threat, and understanding why this might be important for us to understand, especially in the context of the NDS is imperative to think about what does it mean to build enduring advantage. So looking at sort of internal processes, how are we able to make decisions and align resources to enable the kind of multi outcomes we need. So that was sort of the context in which we were looking to really go deep into how some of our potential competitors were thinking about their internal decision making and how they were looking to affect outcomes. I'll just a word here on the budget chart. So we sought mightily to try and come up with some basis for cross-case comparison through this effort. I think we generally found that it was very challenging to do so in a consistent way. Even something like how much does a country spend on defense was hard because there are issues around purchasing parity. There's issues around, what's included in one country's defense budget or not. It's going to be a function of how they think about national health care, how they think about veterans, how they think about diplomacy, or other things that we have made choices on how to bound our defense budget, but might be different than how some of our comparative case countries did. So very, very hard to come up with some consistent basis for comparison. We'll be showing these charts just to give you a general sense of context and trends, but I do so with that caveat that it's hard. The data we present here is from SIPRI, which is a widely cited source on international defense spending. So that's where the numbers come from. Certainly aware of the challenges here, but that's something we're trying to do, just provide some context. So on the China line in particular here, just to set the stage for our comments, of note is that China's defense budget has been increasing in real terms over many decades. Between 2000 and 2016, it was about 10% a year in real term, and a little bit slower pace by the time this work was completed. But still, these are decades of substantial and sustained investments in defense. So that's one point I'd want to make on this slide. I have this slide is just an overview of what some of the takeaways from these competitor case studies are, and then I'll talk a little bit more in detail to each one. I'll say that I had an opportunity with Megan to lead this overall effort, but I'm definitely not a Russia or China regional SME. We have experts who actually did do their primary source research. So if you're interested in going into detail on any of these cases, definitely recommend you check them out. Or send me an email. I'm happy to connect you with our colleagues who can answer your questions. But at a high level, I think the observations we'd want to make about these cases, these are definitely countries, but by virtue of their decision-making and governance systems, who can make firm decisions about priorities and can make decisions about how to allocate resources to advance those. So they clearly have unique features for priority setting that we don't have in the United States. However, we also note that the ability to actually take that priority setting and turn it into outcomes is more complicated. So we'll talk about a couple of ways in which that may be insufficient for actually achieving the kinds of ends that were set out. We also find that there are some risks, that ability to set the agenda in a more centralized way also poses some risks for efficiency or effectiveness or quality control, which are important to keep in mind too, as we're thinking about how to balance that need for more agility and speed with the kind of oversight to make sure that we're accomplishing our objectives. And then finally, it was notable to us that these are countries that are both aware of some of the shortcomings of their own budget systems and have looked to Western models, including to US DoD PPE, for insight into how they might reform their budget systems. So we thought that was worth noting. It's certainly not a case that where they feel like they've figured it out. I think that there definitely are trade-offs in how they view their resource allocation system as there is for the US. So I'll talk a little bit more about each of these. So as I noted, these are definitely countries for which they have more ability to set priorities. But some of the things that make actually achieving outcomes more difficult. First is something that one of our colleagues, Mike Mazar, calls societal foundations of national competitiveness. And it's about workforce, it's about economy, it's about industrial capacity or access to critical materials. It's about a lot of things that may not just be about decision-making processes. So if you don't have these things, it can be difficult to actually achieve the kinds of effects that are desired. And also, we also note that these decision-making processes don't always yield consistent outcomes, not just for that reason I just mentioned, but also because there's going to be uneven success depending on other factors. So often hypersonics is cited as a story of China's more recent modernization success. But that's in the context of sort of a very long successful missile program. And there have been other areas where sustained investment and have not generated the same outcomes. So just to note that there's sort of uneven success across modernization efforts that should be taken into account when we're thinking about the effect of these specific processes. And then I noted that Russia's relatively recent at that time invasion of Ukraine when we were starting this work. There were a lot of decisions in Russia on how to reprioritize and revector to support the war effort. And there then, and I think now we're still seeing that doesn't always mean that they can marshal the kind of military force they need in terms of people. It doesn't necessarily mean they have the supply chain or industrial base to meet some of their needs. So it's one thing to say, this war effort is our highest priority. It's another thing to actually have the resources needed to make that real. So those are some of the things that we thought made sort of implementation more complicated than just the decision making. So these are countries that definitely prioritize long-term planning. I mean, we talked about the sustained investment in China and sort of this long-term program towards modernization, which has generated such tremendous success for them. That is certainly the case. Russia has a 10-year procurement plan called the State Armaments Program, and China has something called the 5-year program. I know it's funny, but that is also around their military modernization effort. So they definitely think about their military capabilities and over the long term. But they also have shown an ability to flex as needed. Russia has, I think in November of 2022, abandoned their current SDO to try and reorient towards more urgent war needs. So they have long-term plans, but they have demonstrated an ability to sort of flex as needed. I think that for China, it's a little bit harder to know, with the kind of growth that they've had and just the available resources for defense, given the economic growth and how much they've been investing in defense, whether they have to make the same kinds of trade-offs to the same extent as has Russia with the war effort, for example. But they have more money, so may be able to revector without having to make the same kinds of hard trades. So unlike the United States, there's fewer sort of internal potential checks and balances that could create friction in how modernization priorities are advanced. And that means, and there is in China more of a connection between plans and programs, not a perfect one, but there is more of an ability to make that link. We note that there are in both of these countries, but certainly in China also, extra budgetary resources, which can sort of muddle how well national resources are put toward national ends. So there's China things collected in fines or fees or sale of land rights or mining rights or other things which may not go exactly as we expect into the defense program, and certainly invites some degree of corruption. But in general, there is an ability to align resources to budgets in a more consistent way. I think I've already talked to the SAP, but there is clearly a desire to have long-term plans, but some ability to flex as well. Suggested this, but there are relatively weak mechanisms in these countries to avoid graft or to make sure that decisions are actually put towards resourcing military priorities as anticipated. This has obviously been very prevalent. This has been very evident in Ukraine, where quality control issues created tremendous battlefield challenges for the Russian military, especially in the early phases. So I think thinking about how, what if you sort of have more unitary decision making that can facilitate speed or agility, how to do so in the right balance of also making sure that you have the kind of oversight to make sure that your investments are efficient or effective. So I noted that there are, have been recent efforts to reform the budgeting system in both China and Russia. Definitely look to the report to find more details on what this has involved. But I think that the root cause of each is that there are obviously inefficiencies in these systems to which decision makers are looking to address and improve. There have been efforts to try and implement, Western best practices to a degree. For Russia, I guess I would include as a best practice their sovereign wealth fund that they have out of oil and gas revenue, which has been very helpful for sort of mitigating some of the challenges imposed by sanctions and to just sort of be able to have a little bit of a buffer to meet wartime requirements, has been helpful to them. So, and in general, it's a system that prioritizes fiscal conservatism. I mean, meaning not having having an ability, being able to spend what you have, and that, I'm not saying that's necessarily they look to the West to see this, but there have been efforts to look to the West for other models that might better meet their needs for stability and sustained investment, and those are features that we've obviously value as well. Just a few comments on what lessons should we draw. I mean, these are really very, very different countries than the United States in terms of political culture and governance and values and strategic orientation. I think there is, as we think about ways to make our system faster and more agile, I think there's been a tendency to look to countries for which that's less of a concern and say maybe they haven't figured out. I think that there are clearly limitations to how far you want to take that, both because of all of the differences I note, but also because there are outcomes that they encounter that are, I think we'd want to question, how we can make sure that those are not features that we inadvertently bring into ours. But I think there are, several things we might think about. One thing is the societal foundations part. The idea that if we want to make sure that we have, industrial base that's responsive and ready, if we want to make sure that we have, ability to scale production or to, meet the variety of needs we might need to resource innovation, it's going to take more than just changing the internal decision-making process. It's going to probably take investment in our people and in our in our industrial capacity and thinking about ways to better incentivize and enable these. So it's just there's a broad base requirement to really enable the kinds of outcomes we want. So I think we should definitely keep that in mind. So having the ability to do long-term planning is certainly helpful. But there's risks to the efficiency and effectiveness I mentioned. There also might be risks to some of the innovation outcomes that we've been talking about over the last for this conference. So I think we want to think carefully about that. But I think some of the features that are appealing about these cases are certainly the ability to ensure some stability and sustained funding to do hard things. Some of these big modernization efforts are hard and will require many years. So, I mean, I think to some degree, thinking about those areas where you need more stability in your budget and areas where you might want more agility would be useful to do so in a more nuanced way. And then in China, I didn't talk about this in too much detail, but in China, there were some examples of for some efforts delegating some decision-making to lower level project managers. So not to overstate how much this happens, but I think that ability to try and, say, well, what's our national, I think in the case that we discuss, it's about the jet engine program, which has been a problem for them. So I think, saying like, we're going to prioritize this program, we're going to allocate this money towards it, but how you actually get there has been delegated to project managers. Something like that could be efficient for the United States in terms of, aligning strategy to resources, but also not being overly prescriptive in solutions. And then finally, I mean, goes without saying, oversight is really important, and that's the lack and the lack of that in these cases and the challenges that it introduces, I think is something worth dwelling on and thinking about, how can we make sure that those are features of the system that we don't go down that road as we think about what's best for reforming DoD-PPE. I think those are the main points I want to make. I'll pass it over to Megan to talk about the allied case studies, but just quickly, this was an awesome team and just a fantastic opportunity for us to support the commission in their work. These are the people who worked on it. I won't name them all, but it's been a pleasure to work with all of them. So just wanted to make sure they got a shout out. Megan, over to you to talk about the allied case studies.
think they're gonna flip the slide deck. There. Okay, I'd also like to thank the commission. We spent almost 2 years with them and it was a fantastic partnership. Our team was thrilled to work with them, and also Lara, thank you. I think we had a lot of material. They sat through a lot of briefings. We're talking hours and hours of briefings. I see still. While they're doing that, I will.
Oh,
Just keep going.
yeah.
Okay, as Lara and Stephanie already discussed, examining allied and partner nations resource management processes was part of this congressional mandate. This analysis was important because the PPE Commission was seeking other potential ways that the US DoD can improve its own defense resource management. Allies and partner nations offer some lessons to consider. Additionally, security challenges in Europe and the Indo-Pacific require these countries to develop new defense capabilities, modernize legacy infrastructure, and boost industrial capacity, all of which entail large financial commitments. These challenges present opportunities for the countries to work together toward shared goals, but also require the US and its allies and partners to develop better combined approaches. Do you want to see if is that the same slide? There isn't. Okay. Okay, so we will skip the one with the reports. There are two main volumes that are on allies and partners. Basically what we did was we split them by three countries, UK, Australia, and Canada were in the first phase, and the second phase were France, Germany, Japan, Singapore, and Sweden. So for the methodology, I think probably the critical thing is, yes, we followed everything that Stephanie already talked about, but because we had colleagues in RAND Europe and RAND Australia, that was very helpful with understanding the context of how these governments actually do their resource management. It's different than the US trying to interpret their perspective. Okay, a key aspect of the National Defense Strategy's calls for integrated deterrence is incorporation of allies and partners at every stage of defense planning, reducing institutional barriers, including those that inhibit collective research and development, planning and interoperability, intelligence and information sharing, and export of key capabilities. So the figure on the right provides military expenditure since the early 1990s. As you can see, the US clearly spends more than others according to SIPRI data. China's, as Stephanie already mentioned, their spending has been increasing steadily over time. The other allies and partners, though, have been increasing along with Russia. It's just hard to see on this chart. To gather lessons from allies and partners grappling with similar challenges, we did look at the three case studies, UK, Australia, and Canada. Those are the ones I'm going to talk about today. We have another volume with the rest. The Australian and Canadian and British political systems shape the roles and contours of resource planning. In all three countries, the executive branch has powered the purse, and this reduces political friction and also discussions over appropriations. There are some notable differences between the US and the selected allies and partners that we're talking about here in terms of their political systems, their population sizes, industrial bases, workforce sizes, and military expenditures. However, we found that despite all of these differences, there are similarities in how all four of these countries generally approach resource management. There are many decision makers involved throughout the processes. Strategic planning is a key input that is used explicitly to connect priorities to how much funding is spent to address military threats. Ongoing discussions are held between defense departments and decision makers who control the power of the purse to justify how forces and programs will use the funding. So all of this should sound familiar. Defense departments receive and spend funding according to agreed upon appropriation rules and then use certain mechanisms if plans change to carry over funding. Finally, oversight is a key mechanism for making sure that budgeting is appropriately spent. So all of this is very similar to what the US does. Of particular concern, though, is that for the U.S. system is its yearly vulnerability to political gridlock, continuing resolutions, and potential government shutdowns. These are all things that allies do not endure. Without altering the U.S. system of government, which we know deliberately wants an executive and a legislative branch to be able to be in the discussions on defense planning, the United States could learn from allied and partner budgetary mechanisms that provide extra budget surety for major multi-year investments without requiring a reevaluation every year. For example, the UK defense budgeting system benefits from multi-annual spending plans, programs, and contracts. The UK Ministry of Defense can sign decade-long portfolio management agreements with UK firms to provide the long-term certainty. The UK system also allows for advanced funding early in a budget year to ensure continuous government operations, thereby avoiding the possibility and cost of a government shutdown. Likewise, Australia's defense budgeting processes provide a high level of certainty for major military capabilities. These far-sighted processes strengthen the linkage between strategy and resources, reducing the prospects for misused funds or inefficiency, and limit the risk of blocked funding from year to year. Strategic planning mechanisms in Australia, Canada, and the UK harness defense spending priorities and drive budget execution. Each country starts its defense resource management processes with strategic planning that tries to identify key priorities for finite funds in defense budgets much smaller than the US. Additionally, similar budget mechanics are used in Australia, Canada, the UK, and the United States. All 4 countries carry over funds, move funds across portfolios, appropriate funds with different expirations, and supplement funds for emerging needs. The use of these mechanics varies by case, though. There's been a shared pivot towards supporting agility and innovation in the face of lengthy acquisition cycles. The proposed Australian Strategic Research Agency would be required to move funds between projects to accelerate innovation. Canada, whose strategic plan calls for its Department of National Defense to exploit defense innovation, is partnering with the US on modernization of NORAD. Like DoD, the UK Ministry of Defense is experimenting with ways to encourage innovation, including a new innovation fund, which allows the chief scientific advisor to pursue high-risk projects as part of the main research and development budget. There are several key insights that we learned from these case studies. Australia, Canada, and the UK have shared values with the US and converge on a similar strategic vision. Any changes to the DoD's resource planning policies and processes and decisions will have downstream effects on allies and partners. Therefore, accelerating US DoD agility would benefit allied and partner nations as well. Each country struggles to balance the need to keep pace with strategic threats, execute longer-term plans, use deliberate processes with sufficient oversight, and encourage innovation. Foreign military sales is an important mechanism for strategic convergence, interconnectedness, interoperability, and interchangeability, but this provides myriad challenges for coordination and resource planning. One downside is the reliance on exchange rate volatility that requires budget adjustments over the years. Another downside is less flexibility to independently act with less ability to independently act with flexibility. Australia, Canada, and the UK have less legislative intervention in budget processes, as I mentioned before, relative to the US, no continuing resolutions, according to the subject matter experts that we talked to. Jointness and resource planning appears to be easier in Australia, Canada, and the UK, given the smaller size of their militaries. In each country, there is a greater level of joint financial governance than in the US, with less focus on service-centric views and more focus on cross-governmental mechanisms and joint funds. Australia, Canada, and the UK place a larger emphasis on budget predictability and stability than on agility due to their limited resources. Australia's defense is assured of sustained funding for 4 years and plans investments out as far as 20 years. Canada's DND notional budget is guaranteed to continue year on year, and the DND's capital investment fund ensures that approved projects are paid for years or even decades. The UK Ministry of Defense programs are normally guaranteed funding for 3 to 5 years, with estimates out to 10 years. In contrast, the US Congress must revisit and vote on the DoD's budget every year. Despite the common emphasis on stability, each system provides some flexibility to address unanticipated changes. The Australian Parliament can boost the defense budget in periods of national emergencies or overseas military operations, and the government can supplement defense's allocation to alleviate inflationary pressures. In Canada, regular supplementary parliamentary spending periods can help close unforeseen D&D funding gaps. The UK Ministry of Defence has mechanisms called the virement process for moving money between accounts and assessing additional funds within a funding year. Australia, Canada, and the UK have independent oversight functions for ensuring transparency, audits, or contestability of budgeting processes, not that all dissimilar than the US. Accountability in Australia is provided through the Australian National Audit Office, the Portfolio Budget Statement, the Contestability Function, and other reviews. Parliamentary oversight or scrutiny is Canada's, is aided by analyses from the Auditor General, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and at times the Library of the Parliament. Each year, the UK Ministry of Defence is externally vetted by the House of Commons, Public Accounts Committee, UK National Audit Office, Comptroller, and Auditor General to ensure that all these funds are not misused. Not unlike the US, despite the pushback to accept additional risk, there is still a cultural aversion to risk in the Australian, Canadian, and budget processes and British budget processes. In Australia, stakeholders seek to spend within annual budgets, which is intuitively prudent, but could limit agility by lengthening review times and holding up funds for other projects. Canada's political structure does not allow Parliament to drastically change funding for departments, including the D&D, beyond what was requested. And finally, the experiments by the UK Ministry of Defence to encourage innovation have not made the MOD culture less risk averse. Again, this is the RAND team. Most of the people that worked on the allies and partners are on the left and on the right. So over to you, Heidi.
Thank you, Megan. If we can just go ahead and get the slides queued up. As highlighted by Stephanie and Megan, the Commission had a mandate to examine DoD's PPE processes and practices and consider potential alternatives. As part of this review, the Commission requested RAND to provide an independent analysis of PPE-like functions in non-DoD federal agencies. Through this work, we investigated what insights DoD can learn from the budgeting processes of other U.S. federal agencies. Now, the methodology employed in these case studies followed the same common template used to shape the previously discussed case studies and included inputs from a diverse interdisciplinary RAND team. And as a part of that team, I'm honored to be presenting on behalf of my colleagues today. For the non-DoD federal agencies case studies, the Commission requested RAND examine the PPE processes and practices of 6 specific agencies: the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, NASA, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and the U.S. Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration. These agencies were identified as agencies that, in accordance with their missions, faced issues similar to those faced by DoD. So enabling innovation, making high-tech investments, transitioning technology into the field, and remaining flexible in response to dynamic mission needs. Now, as further context for this conversation, it's important to note that DoD's PPE system has influenced resource planning across the federal government. 4 of the agencies examined had resource planning processes that were included in a 1965 directive from President Johnson to introduce DoD's PPE precursor across the federal government. And this experiment ended in 1970. The other 2 agencies examined, DHS and ODNI, or those stood up in the modern era, also have resource planning processes that resonate with DoD's PPE system. Now, keeping in mind that each agency is distinct from DoD and that their processes have evolved away from DoD in some respects, their stories provide key insights to the Commission related to strategic planning, enterprise decision-making, and institutional control. Go ahead and survey some of the high-level themes from those key insights. There are opportunities to strengthen connection of strategy to budgets. These agencies have a range of mechanisms that enable budget flexibility and agility, and allow resilience in the face of budgetary turbulence. The emphasis on evaluation, not execution, and some processes could be instructive for DoD. Implementation of a PPE-like process at the scale of DoD is resource intensive, institutionally challenging, and sometimes infeasible for smaller agencies. And finally, consolidated information management systems could help improve resource decision-making. Now, as discussed, many agency resource planning systems were initially modeled in some fashion after DoD's, but have since evolved away from the DoD template. Despite the movement away from DoD's PPE framework, the agencies examined still generally follow a budgeting process common to most U.S. federal civilian agencies. This process begins with an annual planning cycle and culminates in budget execution and performance evaluation. Grappling with how to link priorities to budgetary decision-making was a theme across all cases. We found that long-term planning in the agencies examined differed in accordance with a number of factors, such as an agency's mission, analytical capabilities, and resource constraints. We attribute this difference in part to some of the inherently dynamic requirements of some agencies' mission sets, DHS and HHS being great examples here. And also, we found the difference to be attributable to the weaker, relative to DoD again, mechanisms for forging forward-looking cross-departmental plans in some agencies, such as DHS and ODNI. Long-term planning is particularly important for some agencies with missions that might require sustained development efforts, such as NASA and NNSA, rather than near-term operational programs. We also found that other agencies have a range of mechanisms that enable budget flexibility and agility. For example, many agencies have relatively more discretion to redirect, reprogram, or transfer appropriated funds. HHS, for example, does not use a common appropriation structure, so budget justifications focus heavily on missions and needs. HHS also has considerable flexibility in reprogramming funds. For example, below a reprogramming threshold of the lesser of 1 million, or 10% of a budget account, HHS is not required to report the action to Congress. NASA appropriations are directly aligned to missions, such as the Webb Space Telescope, and not to accounts. And NSA has no designated colors of money within its budget, and its accounts are all no year, meaning that funds are available until expended. Other agencies can carry over funding from fiscal year to fiscal year, repurpose expiring unobligated balances, and reallocate funds to department-wide capital investments. HHS has access to several flexible spending accounts, such as the non-reoccurring expenses fund, which allows HHS to reallocate expired unobligated funds to capital investments. These flexibility mechanisms are often given multi-year or no-year funding. Mechanisms for enabling agility also help agencies weather continuing resolutions and other sources of budget turbulence. DHS funds are typically budgeted annually, but some programs receive multi-year or no-year appropriations. Congress sometimes also appropriates multi-year funds to DHS major acquisition programs to foster a stable production and contracting environment. VA receives advance appropriations for its veterans medical care and benefits programs. And NASA's 2-year time expiration for appropriations reportedly provides the agency with a cushion in the event that a regular appropriation is delayed. Now, agencies such as ODNI and NSA have replaced the execution phase in their PPE processes with evaluation. Inputs generated during these phases are intended to feed back into the planning phases for the following fiscal year. We also found that DHS has essentially done so in its PPE-like process to better understand the results of its spending. DHS has mandated organizational evaluations and annual evaluation plans. Such work demonstrates an investment by DHS in evaluation and performance measurement activities. Building in explicit mechanisms for evaluation could help DoD's approach to its execution phase. Now, we also found that the implementation of PPE-like processes at the scale of DoD is resource intensive, institutionally challenging, and sometimes infeasible. One area where many of the non-DoD agencies examined cannot emulate a DoD PPE function widely acknowledged to be exemplary is DoD's Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation Office, or CAPE, analytical function. As many of you know, CAPE's mission is to provide DoD with unbiased, independent analysis on resource allocation. In many of the agencies we examined, a CAPE-like function simply does not exist in a comparable size and mission. So, for example, planning, programming, and budgeting for NASA are handled by NASA's Office of the Chief Financial Officer, while a strategic investment division sits under the NASA CFO. It may not be considered an independent organization when it scrutinizes NASA's budget submissions, and its reporting change could present a conflict of interest. We also found that ODNI attempted to emulate the analytical rigor of the CAPE function, but found it difficult to do so. Now, we found substantial effort in the NSA case, on the other hand, to centralize and bolster the rigor of its PPE processes, including the introduction of its Office of Cost Estimating and Program Evaluation, a CAPE-like capability for developing independent cost estimates and analyses of alternatives. An NSA further increased analytical rigor by having its cost analysts report to a single headquarters organization, while also embedding them in NSA program offices. Consolidated resource management information systems could also improve visibility and strengthen decision-making. DHS's consolidation of its PPE information systems has enhanced its ability to create and manage budgets. DHS officials have reported that this consolidated system for generating congressional budget justification documents, developing a 5-year funding plan, and capturing performance management data has automated the generation of certain reports that were previously created manually. Similarly, NNSA's new Form X system reflects an effort to modernize the IT infrastructure on which its PPE decisions rely. As a budget information system, Form X is intended to provide a common budget structure to facilitate insights into plans, gaps, potential redundancies, and potential execution risks. In contrast, the lack of a consolidated budget formulation system has left HHS leadership with limited visibility into the HHS operating division's budgets. Now, while the budgeting processes of the non-DoD federal agencies were originally modeled after DoD, these processes have been adapted to the unique missions of each agency. Despite the movement away from DoD's model, the agencies still use similar planning, programming, budgeting, and execution processes. Given these similarities, there would be no benefit from DoD adopting any of these systems wholesale. However, there is value in exploring the ways in which Congress has provided each agency with budgetary flexibility so that DoD could potentially employ similar mechanisms to support more innovation, to make funding more predictable over multiple years, and to obtain relief from various pain points in the system. In closing, I'll highlight again the tremendous cross-brand team who contributed to this work. And I'll turn things back over to Lara.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So let me assure all of you that as the commission debated and discussed all manner of challenges that PPPE faces, as well as potential recommendations for reform, this research and all the research we did definitely informed that as we looked at best practices across our partners and allies and the other federal agencies. So now we're to the fun part where we get to ask questions. So if you have some, I'll read some online, and then raise a hand, but I will kick it off with one for Stephanie. So how can DoD's decision support systems enable more effective U.S. competitions with China? What are the opportunities afforded by PPPE reform, and what are the limits to what we might practically achieve through process reform?
Yeah. Thanks so much. It's a great question. I guess I would turn to the idea that it's going to take more than the decision processes. I think our colleague who led the China case had a tagline that I liked a lot about, processes can be enablers, but they can't make up for systemic deficiencies. I'm sorry, Tim, if you're out there, didn't capture that exactly. But the idea is that if your resource allocation system is constraining or hampering what you want to accomplish, that's not good. But your system alone can't make up for all the material deficiencies that you may have. Now, that gets back to the societal foundations part, the people, the industrial capacity, the policies and procedures to best leverage and access all the national resources that one needs to really support national security objectives. So I guess I'd want to broaden the conversation beyond PPBE. This is a part of the puzzle, but it's networked with other things that are ongoing right now around requirements, around industrial, around new industrial strategy. There's a lot of activity right now on how we can get these various pieces working more effectively together. So that would be one suggestion, to sort of broaden it and think about PPPE's role in it, but also not thinking that this is going to be an easy button in terms of accomplishing some of the really hard outcomes that we're seeking to affect. And as we think about this very challenging competitive environment.
Thank you. Okay, I see several hands. Okay, you gentlemen, I can't. Yes, please. And what's your name?
Sure. All right, is that better? All right, so a couple years ago, the DoD tried something, the BA-8 process on software. And that it was part of this, attempt at trying something different with the budgeting process, allowing some software portfolio money. And it died on the Hill. It died with the appropriators. It died with the PSMs. It died with the members. I love the idea of PBE reform, but the workforce is frustrated because every time we see something try to be done, there's a lack of willingness on the Hill to partnership and give a little bit of control back into the department on the purse strings. Everything is micromanaged at the Hill. So while maybe I'm saying it, I'm scarred maybe a little bit, but it is a frustration because we get new members of Congress in, we get new PSMs in, and when we try to do different things, it becomes very micromanaged. And I think these are all great. I live in DHS now. I love the fact that we focus on evaluation versus did you spend all your money type of deal. It's a little bit different of a perspective, but I think that's from a workforce perspective. I don't know how other folks may feel, but is the Hill really actually willing to partner and do the reform to not only put stuff in law to change it, but to actually let it happen, to let go of control?
So there's a lot wrapped up in that, right? I'll take this one on. So spent a lot of the last 2 years going over to the Hill every quarter, talking with PSMs, and with members as well, and had a lot of fun testifying in the last couple of months. So there's actually plenty of blame to go around when it comes to defense resourcing. It's not all Congress's fault. It's not all DoD's fault, right? Everybody has a little bit. And so what I'll tell you, when we engage on the Hill, a lot of the complaints we hear from PSMs is the lack of transparency from DoD, how slow they are to answer questions, and the data is often wrong, or it's so stale by the time it gets there, it's useless, right? So that's their complaint about DoD. And then, of course, all of us being practitioners, whether we're acquisition or finance, we have plenty of things where CRs or budget shutdowns, or they moved your money around, right? We have lots of blame to go around. But is Congress willing to make change? Yes. Is it equal across all parts of the defense ecosystem? No, unfortunately. So the authorizers are ready for reform. They're the ones who established the commission. They want us to move faster. I will tell you, they are actively writing language right now and getting it in front of their members for some of these reforms that you'll see, that the 28 recommendations we made. Grab a handout, you'll see some of them there that we've worked with them over the last few months on drafting those ledge proposal language. But you're talking about the appropriators, and they are a much tougher customer, right? So my sense is, if you read the 24 appropriation that came out finally in March, there was language in there about PPP reform, and they talked about how they work with DoD and how they work with DoD. They passed like 80% or more of the reprogramming actions that we send over to the Hill. And the basic message, it was like a page and a half in the appropriation language in the joint explanatory statement. They are willing to work with us, with DoD, if you're going to work with them, if you reach out to them and share information and say, I need help with something. And so basically that message was coming across, and they gave an example over the last several budget cycles. They helped restructure the Army's S&T account, science and technology account, and reduce 93 program elements. by working together. Part of my career, I was at U.S. Special Operations Command as the Deputy Comptroller. We actually worked budget restructure, again, with the Hill, with all 4 defense committees and the Intel committees. We worked together. We had a spreadsheet out. Here's what our budget structure is. Here's what we would like. What do you think? And we iterated back and forth. And then they appropriated it in a new way and worked. So it's got to be more of a partnership, right? So we're not going to be like our partners and allies where a member of parliament's also the Minister of Defense. It's just not going to be that way. We're going to have that inherent tension. So I think for Congress to give us more flexibility, like, trust me, we wanted to ask for 2-year O&M. We asked for 5% carryover instead because 2-year was dead on arrival. They'll probably only give it to DoD if there's more transparency and more frequent engagement.
Our next question is here.
As far as BA8 goes, it's a good and bad news story. It's one of those where it's hard to prove how something didn't happen, right? So because you have one color of money, you're not having to fight between O&M, procurement, and RDT&E, you're on schedule. Because I mean, the way software develops, right, from development all the way through sustainment, it's the same cycle. So when we're budgeting and when you're putting your contract strategy together, you're kind of guessing how much of it's development versus sustainment. And then you get to the year of execution, and you might have a new budget analyst, you might have a new general counsel, God forbid, and they interpret everything differently, and they're going to tell you your color of money mix is wrong. So BA8 takes that out. The commission's recommendation is actually to use any color of money for software for the full scale, from development, procurement, all the way to sustainment, because depending on what you're doing, you might be hardware intensive, software enabled, or software intensive with hardware. And BA8 just creates yet another seam. And so we're arguing that if you're an aircraft programmer, for an example, that you would do your software with your aircraft procurement funds, that you wouldn't split it up between RDT&E and sustainment O&M. So again, we're pushing the envelope even farther than BA8.
We have our next question right over here.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Alex Cherry, Navy Supply Corps. My question is, in addition to colors of money, years of money, we also have some policies like anti-deficiency acts and other policies like that that further restrict ability to use funding. I was just wondering, in the allies and competitors, did you see similar item in their budget that kind of restricted their process as well? And in terms of resource allocation, the DoD has hand in the pot in a lot of things like healthcare, retirements and benefits that other areas of our economy might be doing as well. And I was wondering if our allies and partners had similar duplicative effort in their budget, defense budget as well.
I can speak so one of the countries that's not actually, that I didn't talk about here, but we just released the report. So Singapore is very anti-corruption. And so they have lots of eyes on people who are managing the contracts. So yes, in that case, definitely. But I don't think anything was all that different. It's just the way that the mechanics work out in practice between allies and partners. Again, it's on it's a much smaller scale, but they still have the tensions that we have, just not as bad.
Okay. Hi, Esma Ershen. I have a CRA question, or maybe the long adverse effects of the long-term CRA we have been in for years. I'm very familiar with it as a career contracting officer, and this year I'm managing R&D programs. And, the way the R&D program runs is quite different than doing contracts, executing, etc. Has anybody done a deep dive into effects of CRA that has been happening over the years? When I started my career, it was maybe a couple of months, and then it kept extending and extending and extending. So I'm just wondering if there's any study out there that is looking into this.
Well, we did look into it quite a bit as a commission and looked at over the last 20 or so years, we've only had on-time budgets a couple of times. Recently, I think it was Secretary LaPlante that talked about basically running a race and taking a knee every quarter mile. I think that's a great way of describing what it does. And then the comptroller, Mr. McCord, I think quantified it like 5 years of lost capability with a number of CRs. And so we looked at it significantly as a commission and looked at ways to mitigate it. Since we can't change our form of government to a parliamentary one where they basically shut down if they don't pass a budget, ways to allow some new starts. And so it really impacted some of our recommendations because it's so detrimental to delivering capability, right? Ultimately, sure, your execution is going to be behind, but the real problem is delivering capability to the warfighter. And I'll let you add.
I'll just add a few thoughts. So we looked at this a little bit a few years ago. At that time, GAO had done some good work looking at case studies. It's hard because it can be difficult to really get quantifiable numbers on what the effects are in terms of, time wasted or effort wasted, or so we tried to look at, but so I'll say that at that time we were looking at GAO had done these case studies that were extraordinarily helpful. We tried to look at procurement award contracts. So we were looking at, so when a CR happens, there's the department can issue anomalies that says, please don't, no CR for these things because these things are really important. So they request that some things be exempted or be treated differently. So we looked at, we focused on those programs and looked at, what the sort of planned inventory was on what timeline and tried to quantify the effect of a slippage or, what was the effect. And I'll say it was very, very hard to do this quantifiably. I think a part of our thinking was that there are ways in which for certain kinds of investments, especially in the first quarter, DoD has adjusted its practices in ways that can make it very hard to see exactly some of the inefficiencies in the data. So I think that, talking to senior leaders or getting more qualitative inputs on the effects has at least, that's been the focus that I've seen of the analysis, because it can be quite hard to quantify. But I'll say that we've not talked to, it is very pervasive sentiment that the effects are tremendous. They're widespread. They affect morale, they affect efficiency, they affect effectiveness, they affect, even just what can be accomplished. So there are, I think that there's very strong evidence to suggest that there are pronounced effects, but quantifying them has at least most recent research I've seen has been quite difficult.
And just a funny aside, so we had a SASC hearing in March. This was while we were still in a CR. And Senator Kane said, oh, you could just fix the budget problem being on time if you move the fiscal year to 1 January. I was like, it's March right now, and we're still in a CR. Oh, I thought it was 3:30.
Me too.
It said 3:30 and on my schedule. 3:30 is when we end. We started at 2:15. That's okay. It's all good. I'll shift. We do have one question online that I'll read. I'm sorry, it's a little long. A lot of this comparison has a lot to do with the Defense Industrial Base Challenge, which is a U.S. challenge as well as an allied nations challenge, especially now with the situation with Ukraine and the Middle East. What inputs would you suggest from your work to add to the newly published National Defense Industry Strategy?
I think one thing that needs to be worked out is how the PPB or PPB-like processes work together between the U.S. and the allies. We heard lots of anecdotes of how difficult it is to align, like the fiscal years are different, exchange rates are different. Like we may make a decision on a weapon system in the U.S. and it is released publicly, but yet the other country has not said anything publicly yet. So it causes a bunch of ripple effects. So I think there's a lot of things that probably could be worked through. The intellectual property issues, I think that's something that I know it's part of the industrial base issues that needs to be worked out. I know we're working through some of that with AUKUS. But the issue of co-production for munitions, I think will bring some of that to the forefront, and hopefully maybe that'll be one of the cases where we've started to work through some of this. What else?
Other questions from the audience? Go ahead. I know you're a captain. I can't see your name though.
Ryan Wykenet, contracting, Air Force. I'm actually writing my thesis about your reform, so
Oh, my
I-
God.
it's a good thing. It's a good thing. But out of the 28 recommendations, right, we
Yeah.
really enjoyed the new defensive resourcing system, right? That's a great plan. But what could be implemented immediately or soon or in relative short term that could be successful?
So as I said, 28 recommendations. Some of them don't require any policy changes. One of the ones I think many of you will love, we talk about delegation of authority. We saw it in the private sector. We see it in the other countries. And so we talk about OSD delegating some of their general transfer authority down to the services so that the services have a little bit more skin in the game when they do the major reprogrammings, the above threshold reprogrammings. But the other delegation is to delegate down the below threshold reprogramming. So for the Air Force or the Army, Navy to delegate down to their PEOs, to their commanders, some of that below threshold reprogramming, because it's kind of silly. If you have a PEO responsible for $10 billion, he or she's being held accountable for it, but they don't have the authority to move $15 million in their portfolio. It's a bit absurd. So that's one of our big recommendations. And again, that's a practice. There's nothing in writing that has to be changed. Another good one is how you write your justification books. So I don't know how many of you have ever gone out and read a J book, your RDT&E documents, your procurement documents, you're shaking your head. So like the books, if they're bound, they're like this big, right? There's over 40,000 pages of unclassified ones that go over to the Hill. I can tell you there's not a lot of training on how you write them, and what you say can paint you yourself into a corner, right? So the example in our report, we talk about a pen. I put in my justification books, I wanted to buy a blue pen. But when the budget came out, there was a better deal on green pens. But I said I was going to buy blue, right? So what do I have a notification issue? Is it a new start? Or why didn't I just call it a writing utensil? Right? I have a real world example of that too. When I was the finance chief for EELV, the Evolved Expendable Launch Vehicle, SpaceX was coming onto the scene. And all of our procurement documents said we were buying Atlas and Delta rockets from the United Launch Alliance. And my PEO says, well, what if I want to buy a SpaceX rocket? And I'm like, gonna have to do a notification because not in there. We could have just talked about buying a launch capability or a launch service, right? So a better care and how you write your justification books, you can do that today for your next, it's for your next budget submission, right? But that is a very simple thing. And as the program manager or the contracting officer or the engineer, you should absolutely be involved with us budget nerds who actually write the documents to make sure that we are accurate, but not overly prescriptive so that you can't flex to how your requirement changed, how your threat changed, and how the technology has changed. That's just a couple examples off the top of my head. But again, as far as the budget structure itself today, it's largely DoD's own design and what it looks like. It's how we've constructed it to how we want to control it internally. There's only a few line items where Congress said you will have a line item that shows me cyber or sexual assault. The rest of it, DoD has asked for it that way. But to change it, you're going to have to work with Congress hand in hand. I see we're down to about a couple minutes left. I can maybe take one more question. Back in the room.
Thanks. I'm Jen Taylor. I'm with the Institute for Defense Analyses, but not the team that supported the commission. My question is, and I'm sorry if you covered this and I missed it, how did you select the allies and partners that you looked at? And I'm kind of wondering, it would have been interesting if there was a lower budget to see what there might have done differently as opposed to sort of how they build out their budget and think about their own capabilities in say like a Ecuador or a Brazil or something like that, that might be kind of out of left field. You've kind of got some traditional players. So I just wanted to hear a bit more about how you selected them.
So I think there were several factors. It was within, with a conversation with the commission. It was partly by that they would be someone that we work with typically. So, there's a benefit to that now that we've got, volumes of information about the UK's budgeting system. So if you're working with the UK and you're in DoD, you've learned something. So there's that. There's also the fact that, who would be easier to get information on? I mean, that was part of it. So some of these smaller countries, I think it would have been much harder. We had offices in Australia and in the UK. And so that helped a bit with that. There were some that we thought would be good, like South Korea, we wanted to do one on, or potentially Israel, and those dropped off the list because we had other potential opportunities. So I don't know if something else was going on behind the scenes.
I'll just, maybe the closest to the kind of case you're thinking about was Singapore, and that was certainly a regional, important regional actor, but different scale than these. And I think if you do look at that case, there are some lessons about how they chose to be selective about what kinds of capabilities they wanted. You know, they're going to buy certain kinds of capabilities in the international market, but they're really going to have an industrial base that's strong on sustainment or whatever. So sort of choosing how to complement what they get internationally from what they do organically. So that's probably the closest example. But I do think that I think that we were interested in cases that had enough of a large enough military to be making some of these decisions about, you know, how to manage, how to think about the domestic industrial base, how to enable innovation, things like that. So that we did want countries that had some degree of capability and weren't just, you know, really very niche players.
Thanks. That was a great question. And I want to thank all of you for your time and attention and thank our great panelists that were here today. So, all right, that's it for panel 9.